Economic Incentives for the Energy Transition. Interview with Benjamin Görlach, Episode 66. Welcome to the My Energy 2050 podcast, where we speak to the people building a clean energy system by 2050. I'm your host, Michael LaBelle. This week, we speak with Benjamin Görlach, Head of Economics and Policy Assessment at the Ecologic Institute. If you like wide-ranging interviews about the policy challenges of navigating the current energy crisis in Europe, this episode is for you. Benjamin and I cover everything from the EU's emission trading system, the dominance of electricity for transport, and the 4i Traction project. If you ever worked on an EU Horizons project, you understand about the need to get the word out about it. And this is what we're doing. It's a great project. It stands for Innovation, Investment, Infrastructure, and Sector Integration. These are, of course, buzzwords, but we get into an in-depth discussion on the investments and infrastructure side of the project. Some of the key issues we address are the price of ETS, the emission trading scheme here in the EU, and whether politicians should be playing with it to reduce overall energy costs. We also talk about how electrification of cars has actually won the day and why shifting away from fossil fuels is simply more profitable. Renewables have simply won. I think probably people argue about that, but let me just say this is my podcast, and maybe we'll take it as a given here. Anyways, the takeaway, since Benjamin is an environmental economist, is there's no going back for both the institutional structures that incentivize investments into renewables and the technology we have today, which is getting us to a zero carbon energy system by 2050. And I just have a few notes before you enjoy the episode. I've been kind of thinking about how to reframe the podcast, how to get the word out about it. But I was just thinking why you need to listen to the My Energy 2050 podcast, not because we have world-leading experts on the energy transition like Benjamin today, but because each episode is equivalent to consuming 10 journal articles, 1 book, and 500 charts on how to implement the energy transition. You ever see any kind of charts out there about, we need to do this and that? A lot of times, not all the time, but we'll just say some of those charts are definitely based on interviews with people. For me, being a qualitative, I would say, researcher, an economic political geographer, it's about understanding what people think about topics. And here, this is the purpose of this podcast, really, is to deliver you information and really insight into the energy transition that you can't get from other places and just a quick read or quick overview. But by actually going out and talking to people, all of us can really learn about the energy transition and how it's being implemented in real time on today, basically, right? I do an interview, and within the week or within a few weeks, each episode comes out. So this is really cutting edge stuff and key people we're talking about here. And I just want to say that it's all guaranteed, actually, that how much information is in each episode fits into 10 journal articles, 1 book, and 500 charts. And you get it all in less than 60 minutes. So it's also great for when you are on the go, driving, or attending a boring conference, right? Just put a little earbud in your ear and go ahead and pay attention to the podcast rather than to the speaker. Okay, a final note. This interview was done for my current role as an Open Society University Network Senior Fellow at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The funding, I took a trip to Berlin. I did it by train, I just want to say. That the funding's been graciously provided to produce the podcast until the end of 2022. Now, the intent of the My Energy 2050 podcast, I just summarize that, but I always say this on each episode, is to spread the knowledge about how the energy system can assist our transition towards a greener future. The content of each episode is great for teaching, research, and identifying how how do you fit in, really? How do you fit into this energy transition? It's always a challenge for me when I wake up each day. That sounds kind of odd, but if you write about this, you do this work every day, you're always thinking about how do you fit in. Anyways, usually I don't fit in. This is why I do a podcast. Okay, now for this week's episode. I'm here today with Benjamin Görlach, Senior Fellow, the Head of the Economics and Policy Assessment at the Ecologic Institute. Benjamin, welcome to the My Energy 2050 podcast.
It's great to be here. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for setting aside the time. And we're in the Ecologic headquarters here. So this is where everything happens. And I was just wondering if you could tell me first, introduce yourself, because from your biography, I see that you're quite interested in environmental economics and ETS, for example, you have experience in. How did you get into this field and why do you find it interesting?
Yeah, sure. So happy to. Yes, so Benjamin Görlach, I'm an environmental economist here at the Ecologic Institute and have been for quite a few years now. I took a stint a little over a decade ago and worked for the German Emissions Trading Authority for 2 years, but then came back to Ecologic, and that's also at that moment when I sort of pivoted into carbon pricing. And that's been kind of the main topic of my work for the last, I would say, 14, 15 years now at this point. Not the only topic of my work, but sort of all my work revolves pretty much around the question of how do you sort of change economic structures and incentives to accelerate the transition that we need towards cleaner energies and towards decarbonization. So it's trying to think of economic approaches as a tool for transforming the economy and how that works. Now, a big chunk of the work indeed does revolve around carbon pricing in its various shapes and guises, so very much around the idea of emissions trading, the European emission trading system, but also have been involved in sort of advising on other cap and trade systems in other countries. But then we also sort of look at taxation and at removal of environmentally harmful subsidies. However, that's sort of a lesser, takes less prominence in our work. And in the area of carbon pricing, one of the things I've been doing and particularly enjoy doing as well is in the area of capacity building for carbon pricing. So trying to help and advise professionals from other countries how to set up cap and trade systems basically in their national context. One of the things that we may want to sort of discuss a little bit more deeply today is I'm also coordinating a European research project, Horizon Europe project called 4i Traction. And it's actually not only about carbon pricing, it's much broader than that. It does look at this, the broad question is in a sense, what would need to happen if you shift gears in EU climate policy, going from incremental and optimizing types of policy approaches that arguably we've seen happening in Europe in the past. What happens or needs to happen if you shift gears and sort of go into a more transformative mode where just lots more change needs to happen in lots of sectors at the same time under very short time pressure with high degrees of uncertainty. How can we actually achieve that, and how can we govern that at the European level? So that's one of the research questions that is now keeping me basically busy at this point in time.
Excellent. And so would you say then how things have progressed over time was it was done much more through an economic incentive like the ETS, and then now you're looking at, and maybe the whole space has shifted much more to a policy-led approach?
Yes, I mean, of course, carbon pricing is also policy-led. It's a type of policy, but it comes from a framework, I think, that is about really sort of optimizing and also encouraging incremental improvements. And so one of the questions that we're also looking at in 4i Traction is to what extent can actually carbon pricing also be a transformative tool? Now, economists would say if the price is high enough, then it can also, of course, drive transformation, but it will do so in a way that perhaps isn't politically or socially acceptable, because you would need to rely on, you would need to accept very high carbon prices to do the very heavy lifting when it comes to phasing out fossil technologies, etc. So I think at that point the political discourse, but also the academic discourse, has sort of come around to accepting that relying I think the days when the discussion was, do we have only a carbon price and nothing else? That discussion, we might have had 10 years ago. That's been sort of settled more or less. So I think nobody really advocates for carbon pricing only anymore. But then the discussion is also on whether the carbon price is kind of the lead or the core instrument in the mix, or whether other tools are needed to do the heavy lifting in a sense, and what the role of the carbon price is in that broader context.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And maybe I can jump to, we had some final questions. We bring the final questions up to the beginning here, and maybe that will actually make everything smoother later on. So yeah, because we have the carbon pricing in place, and that has been in place, but now we have we could say this external change in the economics of the energy sector, to put it lightly. Basically, Russia's war with Ukraine, which has completely changed the politics and the infrastructure and how it's used in the EU, and the supply of natural gas, oil, everything now. And how has that, and how do you see that, and how are you dealing with it, the high energy prices, compared to where the high energy prices were caused by essentially this mechanism for carbon pricing, but now the high price is caused by other factors?
I mean, at the outset, of course, what we're currently seeing in energy markets is really bad news for carbon pricing, in that it just creates a situation where politically it becomes extremely toxic to think about anything that would further add to these prices. And you could, of course, and the argument has been made that if the prices are where they are already anyway, that by itself gives enough of an incentive to conserve energy and to promote renewables, and that at this point in time you don't need the carbon price as much. However, it also, if you do then follow this line of argument and sort of then either freeze carbon prices or even sort of reduce these parts of the incentives, you're also basically going back to this notion of saying, well, okay, climate policy and that part of the transformation can wait, and we have sort of other worries right now. Politically very understandable, but it also sets us up for difficulties later along the way. So I think that's kind of the one of the worrying trends. I mean, if you look at it now, we did go into the 2020s as kind of the decade where lots of things would need to happen at very short time. So many things in setting up or changing the energy system, driving towards cleaner energies, driving into sort of fully renewables, promoting energy efficiency. Lots of things that were also neglected, that didn't happen fast enough in the past, but that would have needed to happen, and that still need to happen. If now basically in the current situation that is pushed to the side, it basically means we're increasing the scale of the problem that we'll need to address in the later half of the 2020s. This is also, I think, one reason why, in terms of sort of looking at the response to the energy crisis and what should be done about it, I would always sort of draw a strong distinction between things that are temporary in nature and that can be reversed. So, for instance, if it's about keeping coal-fired power plants open 1 or 2 years longer, or if it's about them producing more often than they would otherwise have, that's not nice, but emission-wise, it will create some additional emissions. But these are, at least in the European system, under the ETS cap, and it doesn't basically involve any structural change as such necessarily, and that's why would be a bit more relaxed about that. What I see as really more problematic is the question of do we see any new investments into new fossil infrastructure, because that will be there, and it will create political and economic problems somewhere down the line. So that we were at a point when we were starting to discuss what amount of fossil investment do we actually still need, or are we at the point where we actually stop investing into fossil infrastructure altogether? So that was the discussion sort of 2 years ago, and now that is sidelined, and we are seeing big new investments into natural gas import infrastructure. and that's setting us up for sort of more problems in the time ahead. So I think that's an important distinction to make between like what is a temporary change and what basically is a structural change that is getting us setting us into the wrong direction.
So when people start talking about Germany's going to continue using coal, or other countries are going to they're turning back on their coal-fired power plants, we have to remember they still have to pay for those emissions then.
Yeah. Exactly, and it's sort of still part of the EU ETS cap, which will decline, which is already declining, and which will decline much more so in the next years. And so I would tend to think it's not nice to see them running more. I would love to see coal emissions going down quicker than they are, but that's not. I wouldn't see that as a major worry right now, for the reason that they are capped, and you could say this is what the EU ETS cap is there for. So it's more worrying if once you start seeing discussions whether that cap should be changed or not in the light of the current situation, whether we should sort of go back on ambition. That's kind of more worrying, but we're not having. We do see sort of some calls from some European countries as well right now to either pause or freeze the EU ETS price, or to sort of pause the system as such. That is a much more dangerous discussion, I would say. But otherwise, as long as sort of the ETS is there, the coal issue is not that much of a concern, I would say.
So maybe getting back the money is more about taxing the extra profits than suspending the ETS to lower the price.
So yes, certainly also because that's a much more important lever if you look at the numbers. So the contribution of the carbon price to the current electricity price, for instance, is not negligible, but it's relatively small in comparison. So mostly what we're seeing right now is driven by increase in fossil fuel prices, and only to a much smaller extent by the increasing and relatively high carbon price. And so taking away the extra sort of the little extra that comes from the carbon price is not going to do much in terms of lowering bills, but it would create enormous political damage, because then it basically signals that is kind of negotiable, and we can use the carbon price when it fits us, when all the conditions are right. But otherwise, if it gets heavy, if it gets tough, then that's going to be discontinued. And that way, of course, you also undermine the credibility of the political instrument, because you're saying, well, if you sort of lobby long and hard enough, we're going to lower the ambition in that part, and that's for everybody who wants to invest into clean technologies. That's a very bad signal, right? So we've seen this now. So the EU ETS that covers energy generation in Europe and also heavy industries, that's still relatively fine. But we have seen this in some European countries that have, including Germany now, that's decided to pause the national sort of carbon price, which was supposed to increase every year by in increments of €5 per ton, and the next step for that has been paused, which does very, very little in terms of reducing the bills to households, but does a lot in terms of sort of creating exactly that political signal of, we'll go back to carbon pricing when the conditions are right. And that's just, as we're going into a period where this transformation needs to pick up speed and needs to basically also create some noticeable effect on the ground, that's a tricky signal to send.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe it's this specific area here, and maybe I think we can get into some of the areas of the 4i track project. But let me just follow that. We're essentially in the stage, regardless of the war and the impact on the energy price, where fossil fuels need to be phased out. And in one sense, the price would be higher anyways. And now it's beginning to bite. I mean, maybe now it's a bit too extreme. I think most people say it's too extreme now, but because it's really damaging the economies. But on the other hand, this pricing is sending the signal to invest in non-fossil fuels and to be both have increased energy security at the same time as becoming much more sustainable and self-financed or
So I would say this is actually kind of the positive story here, and there is kind of in the situation we're living through, there is there is lots of negatives, but there is also some positives, and one of the positive sides is that indeed it is become clear that this. There's this notion of the energy triangle, the three objectives. It's sort of environmental sustainability, or clean energy, climate-friendly energy. It's affordability, and it is security of supply. And for a long time, the discourse was always on renewables are nice, but they only count sort of into one direction for the environmental sustainability dimension. But they are expensive, and for security of supply, we'll need sort of strong fossil backup, etc. And I think what has become clearer now is that the renewables can support on all three fronts, and basically also energy efficiency can support us on all three fronts. So the whole sort of clean energy transformation is obviously about environmental benefits, but it also increasingly counts towards lowering energy bills, as we're seeing that fossil energy has become extremely expensive. That's also been a boost to the competitiveness of clean energies, which were already competing in many uses, many applications beforehand, but even more so now with exploding gas and oil prices. And obviously, there are also domestic energies where you don't depend on foreign suppliers, not in the same way as you would on a fossil market. So I mean, when we got into sort of longer term visions for importing green hydrogen from other parts of the world, then you're of course also creating new import dependencies here. But even there, these can be imported from many parts of the world. So it's not as in the fossil sector where it's located in very few world regions, and many of them having governance challenges. So I think for green hydrogen, the outlook is a bit more positive. But that's also just one part of the whole story. So the bigger part of the story is these are mostly domestic energy sources that Europe can source domestically, and that are then less dependent on imports. So I think this is kind of one of the positives, that this has taken hold.
Mm-hmm. In some of these areas, maybe we go for shipping and airplanes. Let's just go like that. Where now the cost is higher, and it doesn't seem to be going down lower. But these are traditional, I would say, industries that haven't done too much, or have done some, but the transition's been quite slow. Do you think that now, with these higher oil prices, and it doesn't seem like oil prices are going to go down, like there's a bit of a geopolitical battle going on now in the oil markets, do you think this is going to prompt these industries to actually not just say, oh, we're going to have biofuels to fly with or something like this, right? Or hydrogen to power our ships, but we're going to wait, or because it is still quite expensive to make this transition. Do you see like these bigger industries that do actually have a big impact on CO2 emissions implementing the technologies to transition away from fossil fuels?
Let me sort of take a different route at this question. There are certain industries where I think the answers are also becoming clearer. This is more, I'm thinking more of some of the traditional heavy industries. So like if you think of steel making, for instance, where also there it is clear that sort of blast furnace steel making is not really the thing of the future, and I don't think anybody sort of wants to still invest into that technology in Europe. And the question is, how do we get the alternatives implemented? So it's direct reduction using hydrogen, and then ideally using green hydrogen to make it entirely low carbon, the production process. The tricky thing there is that these industries were in all across Europe, I think, at a point when they were sort of making their plans for how to also manage their own transition into this new technology. So they had and still have their plans to invest, and these transition plans have been under stress, basically under the current conditions. So many of these companies are now in a just very much challenged by the current high energy prices, and that also dries up their the profits that they would otherwise had hoped to invest into making the transition. So I think, but there too, the expectation was never that it's sort of something that they would do by themselves. The idea was always, okay, there needs to be some element of public support. There needs to be some element of de-risking to make these investments feasible through things like carbon contracts for difference. And I think you could then sort of turn it positively and say the case for public support for these kinds of investments has been made even stronger, and it's now clear that it's probably not going to happen at the scale needed if it isn't for public support. So that's kind of the some of these industries where the solutions are ready. I think in shipping and aviation, I have to admit that's sort of stretching the limits of my technological knowledge. But I think there, my impression is it's still much more open as to what technologies will be. And it's also, of course, a matter of perhaps more for flying than more for aviation than for shipping. It's the question of sort of what future scenario are we building for, and are we planning for, and sort of what's the demand for air travel? What will that be in the future? In the past, we've only sort of seen projections of ever growing amounts of travel.
Yeah. Okay. So personal responsibility, along with government commitments and government assistance for industry. Maybe we can bring it to Germany for a minute and talk about because the German government's really assisting industry here. I think it's like 200 billion euros that they're promising to help industry. I could be totally wrong on it, but something like this, right? So it's a huge amount. And I was just wondering, because Germany, relied the most. Well, we won't say relied the most, but Russian gas was integral to their industrial policy and going forward and going green. And then now, it's not happening. It's not coming anymore. Blowing up the pipelines, it's an easy way to stop the gas. But now how is German industry going to adjust to this? And how is the government perceiving their role in helping German industry to adjust?
Yeah. So firstly, the 200 billion that you quoted, this is actually includes private households and industry. And I don't think there's any sort of reliable number yet, at least I haven't seen it, and sort of how exactly the split is going to be. But that's kind of the overall volume of relief, basically, that's been announced to accommodate higher gas prices. And I think also electricity is also part of that. And so going to households, into industry. To answer your question, in terms of how is industry supported, I think at the time it's more about sort of just keeping industry alive. So there will be some immediate assistance still paid out in the winter, including also to industry, and then as of next year, we're expecting to see a cap on a share of the gas consumption. So it's basically the idea that's been put forward, and that applies to households and to industry, is to limit the gas price for a certain share of their consumption, but not to the entire consumption. And the important distinction there is that at the margin, kind of the last units that industries, but also that households consume, will see the full basically marginal price, and so that you do preserve an incentive to reduce emissions, reduce gas consumption. Now, one thing to be said is that for industry, we have already seen that they have reduced their gas consumption because they feel, the contracts are designed in such a way that for households, it takes a while until the higher wholesale gas price trickles through, basically arrives at the individual household level. For industry, they feel the pinch much more immediately, and so therefore we have seen also quite some price increases for industry, and also in response some demand reductions. Demand reduction sounds very nice if it's about sort of increasing efficiency, and that has also happened. But it also involves simply shutting down production units. That can be, as a market organized process, also can be, I guess, sort of okay without wreaking havoc on the industry. So we've seen certain energy intensive parts of the production process, like ammonia production, where Germany is simply importing a lot of ammonia from other countries. There is a sort of sufficiently liquid market for that. There is sufficient production capacities in other countries. There's sufficient import capacities. So that has been relatively easier, but it's trickier in some other production chains where basically that also leads to disruptions of the value chains, of the production chains, and so in those instances, I think it's more where the assessment or the assistance is sort of targeted at keeping industries in business. The one thing that we actually have to say we're seeing some of that, but not nearly enough, is kind of more forward-looking assistance to make households and also industry use less gas in the future, to help them to sort of change their ways. Now the problem is there's lots of things that can be done, but they all can't be done overnight. So for instance, insulating buildings and shifting from gas heating to heat pumps. The scope of what you can do with little investment in short time is just simply quite limited, and it's basically what we're seeing now is kind of the consequence of not doing nearly enough on that for the last decades. And we're seeing also that some European countries that sort of were more active in that space, Scandinavian countries, for instance, now are of course less threatened by the gas price increase and feel it less because they have simply taken steps to insulate their home better, electrify heating, become less dependent on fossil gas for heating.
My next question, up to recently, was electricity more expensive, and then now the push is actually how to make it cheaper, which goes back to really this electricity when 1920s, 1930s, when it was about electrification because it had such a benefit to the economy, and now back to that, where lowering the price of electricity is actually a big policy impetus for politicians, for the economy, for everything. Is that that's kind of a statement, but is that how do you follow that?
And indeed, that is right, because many of these technologies are competing with fossil-based alternatives, right? So if you think in electric cars or also electric trains compared to cars, or electric cars compared to combustion engine cars, heat pumps compared to gas and oil heating, etc. It's always one of the dimension is, of course, competition on the basis of lifetime costs of these different technologies, and they are becoming competitive. One crucial factor in that is the cost of electricity, and so therefore, the quicker we can reduce the cost of electricity, the sooner these technologies will become available. One interesting question is indeed, is there still, if we move into a predominantly renewables-based system, what point is there still for should electricity then be as cheap as possible? There is still an efficiency issue as well, right? So when we talk about, electric cars will be part of the solution, but then there's also the question, what types of electric cars are we envisaging there? And there is an argument for making them sort of as light and as efficient as possible, because then simply the electricity we have will sort of take us further, let us travel more miles.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that would be one reason for saying, perhaps don't just make it as cheap as possible, because efficiency will still be one thing to worry about. And that the other thing is that the timing dimension. So electricity will become cheaper, but it will become cheaper certainly also at certain times. And so there will be times still when electricity is really expensive, times of the day or times of the year, when electricity is in much shorter supply and where we need sort of more flexibility. So the question is, what kind of solutions can we see that basically use lots of electricity when it's cheap, but then also are conserve electricity at those times when it's needed, and valuing that flexibility it takes us back to this question of sort of market design for electricity markets, which is something that current electricity markets don't, but that we need to basically bake into the system, rewarding the flexibility to be shut on and off in terms of consumption. Perhaps just one thing, and this is sort of looping back to one of the discussions earlier on Fit for 55 and sort of pricing in transport and housing. We talked a little bit about this notion of electrification as one of the routes forward. I think generally speaking, the goal of sort of designing this policy mix around the carbon price would always have to be, or to answer this question of what alternatives do you provide, or do you allow for consumers to, and for investors to change their behavior. And just having this is, I think, also where the sort of the old way of thinking on let's have the carbon price as the central, or the one and only the holy grail of climate economics, where that sort of fell short, is that if you don't provide alternatives to households, then having a carbon price is really politically difficult, but also economically not super efficient. So the question is always, do people have do households, but also do companies have a way of responding to these higher carbon prices? And the more we can enable them to respond to higher carbon prices, also the better the system functions. So it's sort of, if you want, the elasticity, the price elasticity of demand is what economists would call that, and in discussion would tend to be sort of taken as a given. This is how consumers respond to higher prices. But I think the point here is that it's not a given. It's actually something that can also be influenced by policies. And if you have policies that sort of enable people to respond to higher fuel prices, by, for instance, public transport, cycling infrastructure, but also a wide variety of different cars on the market with different fuel standards, good information, etc., that enables them to take smarter choices to respond to these prices. And that point, it becomes sort of politically more acceptable, but also the system is going to deliver more emission reduction. And that's why I think the kind of what the conceptual argument is, that why carbon pricing in itself won't do the job, but it's also about creating these alternatives and providing for alternatives to respond to higher prices.
And policies to assist homeowners. So not just punish them because they're not changing, but actually giving them some assistance, whether that's even just technical assistance or financial assistance, to actually move away from fossil fuels.
Exactly. And that's still relatively easier in transport, where you do have often enough different options. Of course, there's also settings where people are simply limited in their choices, and the car, the combustion engine car, is the only one for those solutions. But at the end of the day, that only applies to a very small part of sort of households. It's very big in the political discussion, but at the end of the day, it doesn't, in terms of total numbers, that's not sort of we're worried about. The really trickier thing is in heating, where just simply for a household your options are way more limited, and you only really have a window of changing sort of every decade or so, or every 2 decades, sort of at the point when you move houses, or when you do major retrofits, major upgrades, where you have to install a new heating system. So in that way, and after that, when you've taken that decision, then for the next 10, 20 years, you don't really have too many options left. And that's, I think, indeed where then public policy, all these support programs, support for heat pumps, or also announcing phase-out dates for fossil fuel heating systems, where these can help.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then maybe we should shift a little bit to the 4I track,
Yes.
because actually I think it underlies many of the issues that we've been talking about, and the policies and where things are going. So my first question is, and I know there's a lot of creativity coming up with project names, but what does the 4I stand for? Explain that, and then we'll get into what the project's about, I think.
Of course, happy to do so. So with 4I Traction, we did set ourselves the challenge of thinking through what would transformative climate governance for the EU look like, what would it entail. And then one of the things we sort of decided on early on is let's try and not do this through a sectoral lens this time. So let's not talk through the energy transition or the electricity transition to the heat transition to the transport to the buildings and food and agriculture transition. I think there's fantastic work happening in all these spaces, but we thought, okay, let's try and see if we can get a different angle at this. And this is why we ended up with these 4 I's as kind of cross-cutting challenges, and they kind of structure and define our work in this project. So it's the innovation challenge. How do we get to the right low carbon innovations, but also how do we sort of roll them out at scale? So what are the enabling conditions for new solutions to not only be invented in some lab, but actually to be brought to market maturity quickly enough and to be rolled out at the scale and at the pace that's needed. The second one is the investment challenge. Obviously, the rebuilding our economy to be a clean, renewable-based economy is going to involve massive investments in private homes, in infrastructure, in business, etc. And the question is sort of how do we mobilize the funds that are needed for that, but also how do we sort of channel and shift the funding that currently still goes also into fossil value chains. How do we sort of manage that shift, shifting the investment from the fossil to the renewable side, from the dirty to the clean energies, and what will that do basically also to the financial system? What type of new governance structures are needed in the financial system? So that's the investment eye. The third one is infrastructure, and the infrastructure challenge being one that basically, when we talk about different new innovative solutions that could have a role to play, one crucial question is there going to be an infrastructure to support them? Electric vehicles being sort of one obvious example. If you can support electric vehicles all you want, but if you don't have charging infrastructure in place, then it will not be a feasible strategy. Or green hydrogen is similar. It's an interesting application if you talk about sort of decarbonizing certain applications, for instance, in industry. But the financial, commercial viability of these solutions depends a lot on whether you can actually get the hydrogen or the green hydrogen to the plant at reasonable cost, and that is also an infrastructure question. So you have the question also of sort of how do you transition infrastructure, right? Right now we have Europe is full of fossil-based infrastructure, and the question is not all of that will be needed anymore. So it's about repurposing, rebuilding, but also dismantling some of that infrastructure. How do you sort of organize that process? And it's about overlapping infrastructures. So we talked about, electrification will have a role to play, and so therefore electricity grids will also have a role to play. But then there may also be instances where different infrastructures are competing with each other. So just to give you one example, Denmark to the north of Germany has fantastic wind capacities, and they are not far from the point, and scenarios will say eventually they will sort of reach this point where they have an overabundance of wind energy domestically that they can't sensibly use in Denmark. And then the question is, what do they do with that excess electricity? Do they sort of sell it as electricity to Germany and to the Netherlands and to Poland, to their kind of the southern neighbors in the region? For that to happen, obviously, would need transmission infrastructure for electricity. But the alternative could also be, okay, perhaps they also want to invest into using that electricity to produce, for instance, green hydrogen, and then instead ship that green hydrogen to other parts of Europe, or to send it through a pipeline. So here we have one question where sort of infrastructure really determines which political choices, or political choices determine what infrastructure we need, but also a coordination problem, because that's sort of something that it's not only sort of it's not only a Danish decision, it's basically a decision that eventually, of course, Denmark and Germany and the Netherlands should agree on some kind of outcome for themselves. So that's the infrastructure dimension, and the last one is the integration. The fourth I is about integration, and this is sort of goes back to indeed also these very questions of how do you align decision making happening in different sectors. So with the transformation, we are seeing a change that is faster than we've seen in the past, that is more profound and sort of deeper than it's been in the past, but it's also broader because it's happening in different sectors at the same time. So we're seeing basically an energy transition, a mobility transition, an industrial transformation, all these things happening in parallel, and needing to be coordinated in some degree. Infrastructure was kind of an obvious example, but there's also other sort of ways of keeping that interlinked. And the question is, how do you make for that kind of integrated governance, where in the past policy approaches were mostly about, what's the strategy in sector A, what's the strategy in sector B. So how do we align that? That's kind of what we set out for integration. And as you might have already noticed, then these different eyes are perhaps interesting challenges to look at, but then one of the at the meta level, they are also interrelated. So the infrastructure challenge is in its own way also an investment question of, who pays for that infrastructure. Is it better publicly funded, or is it privately funded? Who is taken on what share of the risk, and how do you sort of compensate for stranded assets and infrastructure is very much also financial and investment question. Innovation is fine, but doesn't happen without infrastructure. So the innovation and the infrastructure dimension also, of course, are interrelated. And obviously, integration is sort of a challenge that cuts across all these. So in themselves, they're also they're also sort of interrelated challenges. Now, that's basically the logic of these four I's. And this is kind of the at the abstract level, kind of the experiment we're doing with this research project to see if it can give us new insights to thinking about European climate policies. As a bit of sort of explaining what the project is all about, what it's doing, it did set out with sort of first a stock taking and backward looking component. So right now we are conducting numerous case studies at the European level for examples where countries have taken steps towards transformative policies. These are being conducted by different partners all across Europe. We have also looked at sort of some international experiences to see where we could find examples of transformation happening. And we've just sort of launched basically the second half of the project, which then will be sort of more forward-looking, which is more about exploring. Okay, so given all this, how could and how should EU climate policy evolve? Basically, with a sort of horizon after 2030. So, if you want, it's about, we talked about Fit for 55 already. Fit for 55 is kind of the current, the hottest game in town in Brussels. The current proposal on the table for changes to the setup of EU climate policy in the next years to take effect basically until 2030. We're asking the question, okay, what comes after that package? What's kind of the next one that might follow it?
Good. And then with this, actually, let's just recap the four I's. So it's innovation, infrastructure, and
investment and integration.
Yes. And integration. Yeah. Okay. So we have our four I's. And then with this, you're working with stakeholders as well. I mean, you have your consortium partners, which are universities and think tanks in this. Yep. And then you also have some like businesses that you're working with. And can you name those? Who are those that, I guess it is?
It's actually sort of, we do have a few industry partners as well, but it's more because the project in itself is more policy focused. And so our main stakeholders tend to be sort of in the policy realm. So we do have, at the European level, at the sort of European Commission, DG Climate and DG Energy, involved in our activities and including sort of as advisory board members, but also in sort of our stakeholder engagement activities. We just 2 weeks ago implemented a policy lab process, which was about going through Brussels and then in a sort of co-creative fashion inviting stakeholders from political institutions, from the Commission, but also from industry associations, from civil society, from academia. So kind of the Brussels climate policy bubble, if you want.
Yes.
Inviting them to sort of spend a day with us on sort of mapping out what could be possible policy avenues for EU climate policy going forward. And that was exactly also in the spirit of, okay, well, let's not worry about sort of Fit for 55. Let's consider that as basically as a given. And let's think about how, what could the next step after that look like?
I mean, I don't want to reveal your findings or anything, but because since we talked a lot about the current energy crisis, and this completely has changed how the policy discussion evolves now. One could imagine that the prices would be so high that this energy transition would be accelerated so quickly because the economics are certainly there, like today, the past couple of months. And how was it for you, maybe just the conversation in this workshop, or however you want to describe the forum that you had? How was the conversation now compared to maybe pre-crisis?
Mm.
Were there some key issues that came up, or kind of how has the thinking changed?
I think on the positive side, one could say that at least it hasn't been derailed, which also I think is a conceivable scenario that under the impression of the current energy prices that you would have had much stronger voice. I mean, you do have these calls for like, let's sort of rethink our climate ambition, and now is not the time to sort of to worry about that. You have few people sort of openly dismissing that, but of course, I mean, transforming to climate neutrality was never uncontested. And those people that didn't agree with the idea, of course, would now use these arguments to push against that. But I think interestingly, at the and of course we were sort of assembling more the climate professionals in Brussels, but there's been little, or we haven't seen at the European level sort of a strong pushback against the sort of the decarbonization, which I think also has to do with the fact that it's become obvious that this is the direction of travel also, for instance, for industry and private business, right? So they are ready to or they are embracing the challenge and sort of rising up to it. And the question is not, I mean, there's not really any plausible alternative scenario to keep investing into high fossil assets. I think that ship has sailed pretty much.
Yeah.
So I think that on a positive note, but then in other ways, of course, the discussion has become much more nuanced. So one thing that, for instance, is really sort of front and center in all discussions is the question of social compensation, social acceptance of these policy measures, and that's also why sort of carbon pricing has a very difficult stand right now, because it is working through by changing prices at this current time when prices are already up at the current levels is a very difficult proposition.
But
this,
wait, I want to interrupt.
Yeah,
I want to, because now it's so interesting because it's about, you think about homeowners or households, we'll phrase it like that, households, and that before, we should kind of help them out. We should help them on this trajectory. But it was more like to go green, to become more sustainable, to reduce their energy use. But now it's imperative because it's about reducing their energy bills, their energy cost, actually, and helping them. And how will this play out, I guess, in the policy realm?
Yeah. So I think that the challenge is recognized. It's more about the question of how do you organize in the most efficient way this process? How do you sort of get acceptance, support to those people to those households that really need it in the most targeted way? One thing that I think is not universally applied, but has sunken in, and something that we would also call for, is when you do that, do it in such a way that you don't undermine the incentives you're trying to provide, right? So keep the incentive intact to reduce emissions and to reduce energy consumption while also assisting households. And that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but essentially it's about what you want to do is you want to reduce the cost of energy, but you don't want to reduce the price of energy. So you want to reduce the household bill, so what households end up paying in the end, but you want to keep the price per unit intact. And one way of doing that is simply sort of returning some of the money on a lump sum basis per household. That's kind of the ideal situation. Tricky to implement in practice because you need the infrastructure to do that. But that's, of course, the ideal solution if you can basically say every household or per capita, you get a certain amount paid back. But then you also have to accept the fact that the price of the unit of fuel you're consuming goes up. So that's kind of the ideal solution. There's also other channels. So one thing that going back to the discussion earlier about providing alternatives, is anything that can help to reduce vulnerability makes a lot of sense. And here one challenge is how to set up programs in such a way that they actually benefit the most vulnerable households first. So i.e. those that live currently in very poorly insulated homes, or also that are economically most disadvantaged. And the tricky thing here is that in the past, I think when we think about sort of retrofits and heating exchange programs, typically these would be set up as sort of government programs where you can apply for a certain a certain grant and then start investing. And that's all nice and well if you have if you're a homeowner and you have money left over to invest and you know how to where to go for to apply for these funds, then that's all fine. But if you're a tenant and you perhaps don't speak the language well, or you don't have any money left over, these things don't help you. So the challenge here is really finding solutions that also work for those households that really need the assistance most. If that's working with homeowners associations or building associations is one step forward, but also finding ways of translating the messages in such a way that they arrive in different targeted households, and finding different ways of getting that out across, not setting up a website somewhere, but really having locally trained people from the neighborhoods that can go out and provide advice at a very much peer-to-peer level. These are also things to think about. It is certainly not an easy task to address, but it's a necessary one. To loop back, I think, to the policy discussion, the place where some of these elements are based in the European discussion, this Fit for 55, is the notion of the social climate fund, which is one element of this Fit for 55, which basically also captures this notion of let's take part of the revenue from carbon pricing and return that to those households most in need, to assist them directly through monetary compensation, or also to provide assistance in reducing emissions.
Mm-hmm. And you're going to develop some scenarios for this for the project.
So in 4 attractions, that's actually one of the downsides, if you want, for these kinds of research projects. When we set up the project was basically designed in 1920, around that time. And at the time, the social question was already rising on the agenda, but it didn't make its way into the basically the terms of reference for this project. And this is why we are having a little bit of a blind spot. We're trying to weave in the social dimension wherever we can. But this is why basically now it wouldn't be a 4 attraction project. If we designed it now, it would be at least a 5 attraction. Okay. The first one would be about inclusiveness, or about equity aspects. So now we have to basically see how we can weave the question into our work. We are addressing it in other projects, obviously, and it is, I think, the central question in lots of the policy debates. Perhaps just one other thing to bring up, going back to this question of how has the discussion changed, and what is the current outlook in the current period. One thing that is somewhat worrying is the investment dimension here, particularly the financial dimension. The fact that we are moving back into a macroeconomic environment with rising interest rates. We actually were in a very nice space in Europe. We had zero or negative interest rates in many European countries for public debt for quite some time. And this is, I think, one of the really big missed opportunities, that we didn't use that a lot more aggressively to fund investments into low carbon infrastructure, which we know we will be needing anyway, and we know it will only, it will require some degree of public support. And we are now moving into a world where we see rising interest rates. Now, all of these investments we're talking about, pretty much all of these investments we're talking about for cleaner technologies, involve an element of upfront cost and reduced cost later, right? Yes. So the initial investment is going to be higher. That's the case for renewables. That's the case for many energy efficiency. You pay now, and then you have a benefit later in terms of reduced energy bills. But there, of course, interest rate is the one crucial determinant to determine, how feasible that investment is. And of course, with a 6 or 7% interest rate, not saying we will get it, but if we go into that makes a whole lot of these investments less attractive than with a 0 or 1% interest rate.
Yes.
And so this is, I think, one of the challenges. We haven't really thought that entirely through to the end, but we would see that as a big challenge in the investment space, to how to accommodate for that.
Okay. Especially in Eastern Europe, the interest rate's even higher there.
Yeah.
So okay, we won't talk about Hungary, where it's 13% at least,
Yeah.
but the other countries as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
okay, and for the I just want to begin maybe wrapping up here then.
Mhm.
For the I introduced it as 4i track, but it's 4i traction project is what is the, well, there's always different deliverables at the end, but what's kind of the overall emphasis that should come out at the end of it?
Yeah. So one of the core outputs, I mean, obviously it's sort of,
Yeah.
I should do justice to all the partners doing great work in all these different work packages. And as these projects are set up, there's tons of work packages, tasks, and great research being produced in different corners of the project. We now have basically the sort of one thing that's just hot off the press is kind of the insights from the international case studies. The national case studies are coming up and will also provide interesting study cases for how transformation can work. But one thing that I'm really very much looking forward to, I mentioned this sort of this policy lab process that has resulted in these different policy avenues, and we'll apply a bit more scrutiny to those going forward to try and get a better understanding of what are the risks and benefits of following a certain paradigm of policy. So if you apply sort of more the market-based, if you follow the market-based route and work through prices and market-based elements, what are the benefits and risks of that, and sort of how compatible, how politically feasible is that versus some of the other alternatives that we sketched there. So getting to a more nuanced understanding of these paradigmatic types of instrument combinations. And when we've done a bit more scrutiny of that, then sort of one of the concluding pieces of work will be to try and bring that back to, okay, what does it mean for EU climate governance, and what is a sort of transformation-ready climate governance? And that's, in a way, kind of then will be the task of answering the big question that we've set ourselves with this project, based on the insights that were gathered, trying to come up with ideas for an EU climate governance. Governance as in sort of the total collection of all these different climate policies, but also the systems, how decisions are made in Europe, what decisions are, where do we need more, where do we see benefit in more centralization, greater centralization, but also perhaps in decentralization. So which things are better left to the member state level. What role for sort of watchdog mechanisms like climate councils or sort of climate laws to sort of give it more structure for this whole process. So in terms of also understanding where do we need to be rigid in making drawing sort of solid lines as to this is direction of travel, but also where do you have to allow for flexibility. And obviously you always need a bit of both, but then the question is, where do you find the sweet spot between allowing sufficient flexibility to account for surprises, but also giving enough rigidity so that the direction of travel is clear for all, private households, investors, policymakers, etc.
Mm-hmm. And then okay, it's almost the last question, but
just if I might just sort of one thing, I don't want to sort of get lost there, is this question of how do you make this also work in accounting for political turbulences that we are seeing, we will continue to see in Europe. So I think this is one thing just important to stress, that it would be easy enough to think about all this in terms of assuming we have blue sky thinking, we have fantastic political institutions, and they would certainly be able to come up with great policies and implement them. But the world is not like that. So we are constrained, or there is sort of an effective constraint as to sort of how rational policy processes are, and we will be expecting to see further shocks and developments, sort of EU governments stirred up. We see positive and negative outcomes, right? So right now we do see the forces sort of also drawing on Europe and different anti-European sentiment growing in parts of Europe, but we also see basically that European countries have come together faced with an external threat, and I think that's sort of underlined the value of cooperation and the need for cooperation. So there's kind of always sort of positive and negative, but this is also one thing that when thinking about European climate governance, of course, we want to sort of come up with analysis and results and recommendations that are also take these very real life constraints into account.
Yeah, actually, that was part of my question. Was
Okay.
was taking into account the current crisis and how things have developed politically. How these scenarios, because it is available on the project website, these national the assessment of the national policies that you have. And my question was the team or those the researchers that reviewed those, were they able to take into account the current political and economic environment, or were they assessing this under like pre-war conditions, basically?
Yeah. So I mean, what we've published so far is mostly really just an assessment of what would need to happen, and it's not kind of in that way not assessment of actual policies being implemented, but more like, so if you take 1.5 degrees serious, and if you take sort of energy transformation serious, what does it tell us about the European climate goals? Finding this is sort of the work that Climate Analytics, the colleagues have done there, finding that we actually even fit for 55, even the 55% reduction target by the end of the decade, which EU considers ambitious, is not ambitious enough if we take the 1.5 degree target serious. It also sort of breaks down, I think, quite nicely what that would entail into sort of energy supply changes across European countries. So the phase out of fossil fuels. This is, I think, one thing where indeed the analysis has been overtaken by reality, because the modeling still assumed first get out of coal and then a few years later get out of gas, and that might well in the current situation be sort of reversed order, that we're seeing gas being prioritized and coal staying on for somewhat longer. But in essence, I think that's and that has, of course, profound implications for sort of how the immediate policies are designed, but it doesn't change the overall picture in the sense of, okay, we need to get out of both of these, and we need to get into renewables very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the very last question, because you brought it up, but for me, it's almost the most interesting one, but I think we have to save it for another day, is this joint action by the EU as a whole, because now we're in this crisis situation, and you said it's impressive how the countries have come together. I was wondering, could you expand on that more? I'm like, because there's always been so much tension in creating these policies and the policy frameworks within the EU to make this energy transition with 2030 goals, 2050 goals, and now, there's a greater, with the limitation of gas imports. This is for you. Let me phrase this as a question.
Yeah.
For you, do you perceive that there is a greater European unity in the area of energy policy?
There are signs there, again, sort of positive and negative, but I think overall more positive than negative. When I was referring to sort of the greater sense of unity, I think it's just in the last half year we've seen the value of having a strong and unified Europe, and of also having sort of inner European solidarity. So I think if that's not going to take care of sort of secession ideas like Brexit forever and ever, but for the time being, I think it sent a strong signal that there is a value to be sort of part of this community of countries, and also to sort of assist and support each other in terms of showing this kind of solidarity. That isn't. It certainly is far from perfect as well. There's many instances where I would have hoped for more coordination. So I think certainly also in terms of crisis, we are seeing a lot of this thinking of their own electorate and their own country, their own system first, and not enough coordination also on energy issues. We've seen that discussion popping up again now, also in the context of relief measures, where it's about, sort of if Germany decides to effectively subsidize its gas, what does it mean for the internal gas market and for sort of costs going up? Then what does it do to markets in other European countries? We had sort of, I think, important, interesting ideas about common purchasing of gas by European countries. So rather than, because now, of course, European countries are in a tough space. They need to, essentially find new suppliers on short notice to get natural gas from. And the way that it's worked out was mostly that, okay, then, on Monday, the German Minister of Economics flies to Dubai or flies to the Gulf countries and sort of makes a deal. And then on Wednesday is the French minister, and the Spanish minister arrives on Friday or something like this. And then obviously that way you are sort of are in a weaker negotiating position because you're sort of divided. And so the idea, should there be a common European purchasing for gas to use the combined market power that Europe can have, that was discussed, hasn't really materialized, and is still one of the, in that space, I think one of the areas where greater coordination would be certainly desirable. I would also see this, we talked about infrastructure development. I think there too, we are seeing more of that happening, so but not nearly enough in terms of then also aligning infrastructure. But for the time being, I mean, things like, for instance, the what's working relatively well is also agreement on using each other's infrastructure for gas supply now, right? So saying this also from a German perspective, that Germany is chose not to invest as much as other European countries into LNG import capacities, now is reliant on LNG capacities in neighboring countries, but that is working relatively well. Another area of sort of solidarity is, if you want, also you could say the French nuclear situation, where French. So part of what's driving the problem in the electricity markets is not only Russia, but it's also the fact that more than half the French nuclear fleet is down, is not producing, and that needs to be made up with increased production in European neighbor countries. That is creating frictions and problems, but it's not resulting in massive political divisions over that. So I think there's many elements where it's sort of that cooperation is actually happening, and is happening in a not always perfect way, but in a robust way, I would say.
Yeah, a robust way. All right, Benjamin, thank you very much. Thank you for setting aside the time, and thank you for talking about everything from ETS to this energy transition and the 4i traction project as well. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure, and indeed hope to continue the discussion.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We produced the My Energy 2050 podcast to learn about cutting-edge research and the people building our clean energy system. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please share it. And remember, each episode is equivalent to consuming 10 journal articles, 1 book, and 500 charts on how to implement the energy transition. And you get it all in less, usually, than 60 minutes for each podcast. Guaranteed. I can actually say no other podcast makes this guarantee. The more we spread our message of the ease of an energy transition, the faster we can make the transition. You can follow us on LinkedIn, where we are most active, on the My Energy 2050 page, or on Twitter and Facebook. I'm your host, Michael LaBelle. Thank you for listening to this week's episode.